Hey everyone, how are you today? I'm Wayne Neal from Guitar 4D, where guitar and the science of learning intersect. Today's video is Learn How to Learn Guitar, Breaking Through Plateaus. So what we're going to learn in today's video is the power law of practicing, what that means and for your practicing and how it works. We're going to review learning principles and myths, which have some cool things in there that'll surprise you. How to do deliberate practice, which is a lot different than the way we usually practice. How our brains learn in general. Why we need desired difficulty. And then finally, how to break through learning plateaus on guitar. And that's the exciting part here. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the learning principles and myths. And we're going to look at first the power law of learning or practicing. And what you'll see here is on the left side we have accuracy and speed. So as it goes up, your accuracy and speed increases, and over time is the time that you're spending practicing and learning, whether it be a song, a solo, or a really, a tough part in a solo, whatever the case may be. And here's what it looks like. So what this tells us is that at first, I'm sure you experienced this, at first you improve very quickly. You learn the initial chords and notes and riffs, and the learning happens very fast, and eventually you get the song up to speed and you're practicing it, and there's probably a few tough spots maybe for you, and you just practice over and over and over again, and you don't seem to get much better. And so this is the classic, plateau that we all experience as musicians, guitarists, whatever the case may be. And so it's something that, you have to recognize that your learning will happen and accuracy and speed will happen very quickly, but at some point it begins to plateau, and then so you spend more and more and more and more time, but only little increments of improvement happen, even though you're investing a lot more time perhaps than you did when you first learned the song. And we're going to talk later about how to deal with that and how to bust through these plateaus, okay? So let's look at some of the principles and myths of learning. So you've probably heard that practice makes perfect, right? We've all heard that. And I would argue that that is partly true and partly false. And so a lot of what I'm going to show you in this video, like the power law of practicing, these principles and other cognitive psychology learning principles and neuroscience principles are based on a ton of research. And so these ideas have evolved even more recently in the last 10 or 15 years, which have disproved many of the myths that we've had about learning. And so this is where this comes from. Lots of research in this area, really some breakthrough findings that are counterintuitive many times. So the first one, practice makes perfect. Well, like I said, I think it's partly true and partly false. Yes, you have to practice. You absolutely have to practice. We all know that. But it's how you practice that decides how perfect you're going to get, given that power law of practicing. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. You might have heard, hey, if you spend 10,000 hours to become, to work on anything, that you become an expert in that particular thing. And there's a lot to be said for that. The more time that you spend, the more of an expert you become in that area. But again, the trick is how you're spending that time and what you're doing with that time and what you're working on and how you're working on it, okay? And we're going to look at that. Another thing you might have heard is we only use 10% of our brains. Well, that again is partly true, partly not true. And when you hear that, what they really mean is that, that our normal functioning or performing or whatever, we're only using 10% of our capabilities. And if we could only tap into the other 90% of the power and capability in our brains, we'd be all that much better. And what actually happens based on MRI scans of the brain when you're acquiring a new skill is that when you're first learning it, you're actually using a lot of your brain, the majority of it. It lights up all over the brain scan. And what's happening in that process is your brain is trying to figure out where it fits in, how to process this new information, and all the neurons that are firing in the brain is trying to figure out, how do I deal with this, where do I put it, etc. And as we acquire that skill and become proficient in it, we actually are using a lot less of our brains, and it looks like about 10%. So the fact of the matter is the more that we become skilled in a particular skill, the more expert we become in that skill, the less of our brain that we're using. And that's good, because then you can use it to learn other skills. And then the trick is how do you store it in long-term memory, and then how do you retrieve that from long-term memory more accurately? And we'll talk about that as well. You might have heard muscle memory, especially as it comes to guitar playing. So the first thing to note is that our muscles do not have memory. And so the memory is actually in the brain, and there's a process that as you're learning skills, you do build that, quote, muscle memory, but I'll show you exactly what's happening in the brain and then how to even support that more so that that muscle memory, as we call it, happens quicker and more robustly so that you can retrieve it out of long-term memory easier. And then finally, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I'm sure all of you have heard that. Again, completely false. And the good news is that we are constantly learning, and our brains are plastic, so to speak. So no matter how old you are, you can actually change the structure and function of the brain and learn lots of new things regardless of your age. So those are a couple of principles I thought you would find interesting, and it also disproves a lot of these things that we've been told and that people really believe in, and conversations you've had, I'm sure, people just believe this and they accept it as being true, some of these things, and they're just not. So that is the case, and that's good news for anyone who wants to learn and be better at their craft of guitar. And the element that, so I have the good news and bad news. First, the good news. So what I just talked about is called neuroplasticity. And what this is that the brain can always change, and it is always changing. So anytime we learn something, neurons connect to each other and build a network like these diagrams are showing on the screen here. And so as we learn something, these neurons connect. Like I said, the brain is sorting out, where do I put this information? What other neurons do I connect to? And that's why it's so active when we're acquiring a new skill. And so, and then the more that we practice and repeat that skill, the neurons are strengthened, right? And so, and it becomes, as you get better, those neurons become stronger and that network becomes stronger. And that's what allows, that's how we store these new skills. And that therein lies your muscle memory. That's what it really is. Also to note too, and I'm sure you've experienced this, right? As you don't use the information in your brain or the skills that you've learned, you'll begin to lose those over time. And it's the brain's way of sort of cleaning up the garbage, if you will, and getting rid of it so that it can make room for new ideas, new skills, new knowledge, new connection, right? Okay, so now the bad news. This is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And basically what it says is that anytime that we're learning a new skill or learning anything, that our confidence is really high relative to the level of expertise that we should have. And I love the what's labeled here as the peak of Mount Stupid, right? How many people have we met that have little knowledge in an area, but their confidence is really high about that? And what happens as you begin to dig into, the content or anything complicated or whatever the case may be, the valley of despair, right? You realize how hard it is to become knowledgeable or skilled in a certain area. And I think this is where a lot of guitarists just drop out and stop playing, because it does have a steep learning curve. But as you begin to practice, you become more expert at something. So just be careful about being overconfident. And the way to counterbalance this is to do two things. One is to measure what you're doing, so that you can measure real learning effects, and outcomes. Am I acquiring the skill the way I should be? And you can record that, record yourself playing. The other method, or measure speed by a metronome or whatever the case may be if you're learning skills or something. The other one is through a teacher, a coach, someone who is over there on the plateau of sustainability and has that knowledge already and can guide you and correct what you're doing. And I'll show you how important that is too here in a moment. So that is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So there you go, the good news and the bad news. Now, you've probably all heard of the comfort zone right here, and I really like this particular chart that says, as things do get challenging, as things do get tough, you have to push through your comfort zone, and through that fear zone, and then into the learning zone. And, the learning zone is where you acquire new skills, and it's also where you're confused most often, and it's challenging, and you're trying to figure things out, and that's your brain, building those neural networks and strengthening those networks as you acquire, new skills. And so very important to keep that in mind, that I'm sure as you've experienced learning anything, right, it's challenging at first. You have to push through it, and many times once you get through the other side, you're like, oh, that wasn't so bad. But there's all these barriers in the way sometimes to getting there. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit here. So what is deliberate practice? Okay, so deliberate practice, as I have here, is a special type of practice. It's something like what I do usually when I practice, right? For many hours, I'll just sit down. I might look at a scale or something, but a lot of times I'm just playing songs and jamming to backing tracks and having fun. It's the fun part of guitar. The problem with that is you're not really learning too much. And sure, it helps you to practice those things, but to really learn and grow as a musician, as a guitarist, you have to do deliberate practice. And the researchers that have looked at this, and this is very well founded, this is deeply studied through many research studies in cognitive and behavioral psychology as well as neuroscience. You have to have a deliberate practice, and to break it down in simplified terms, it's made up of plan, practice, and reflect. Okay, so a lot of us, including me, we just sit down and we, quote, practice. An hour or two goes by or whatever the case may be, and we stop. And that is not the way to really advance, in your craft. And what you should do, and what the research supports, is put a plan together. And that doesn't have to be a major plan. It might be, hey, I'm going to sit down and learn the major pentatonic scale in all 5 positions. And I'm going to set out to do that. And then you set about practicing that. Get the tools that you need to do that. Look at one of my videos or other videos on the subject, and practice. Actually learn those positions and be able to play them. But as you're doing it, the really important part is the reflecting part. The researchers refer to it as metacognition. It's when we're constantly checking in with ourselves, and that's what I mentioned earlier about either measuring what you're doing or having a coach or a teacher that can, correct what you're doing and give you other advice on how to get better. But you want to put that plan together. Okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to learn the major scale and be able to play it at 120 beats per minute on the metronome. And you set out to do that. You practice it and you keep practicing and working on your speed and technique. But each time you play it, you want to sort of look at, well, what am I doing here? Where am I slowing down? Where am I having errors? Is it when I cross from the fifth string to the fourth string? I'm not playing it accurately. I'm hitting a bum note. My fingers muting the string. Whatever the case may be, you want to constantly sort of evaluate what it is you're doing and whether or not you're accomplishing what you set out to do. And so this is very important. And one of the things that you want to do when you do practice, and you've heard, I think, a lot of teachers say, slow it down until you get it, right, and then speed it up. And I'll show you why that's important, going back to the neuroscience for a second. This is a neuron that's in your brain, and there's 86 billion of them approximately in the human brain, and they're constantly building networks of information and other things so that we operate as human beings, so that we can become accomplished musicians, athletes, scholars, business people, whatever the case may be. Now, the thing, as I showed you in that one chart where the network gets reinforced and the network gets stronger as you practice, what's actually happening there? Well, on the axon, which extends out from the nucleus of the neuron, is this substance called the myelin sheath. And each time you practice something, you're building that myelin sheath, and you're making it stronger and thicker. And it's actually a fatty substance with some proteins in it that are wrapping around these axons. And so, when we say muscle memory, it's kind of ironic that it's actually fat cells that are building this sheath around the axon. And so when you practice too fast or you don't practice accurately, you're building a neuron and sheath that supports what it is you're doing, the mistakes that you're making. And that's why it is so critical to get it accurate from the beginning and build up your speed or whatever the case may be by playing it accurately. And that helps reinforce this network and make it stronger and stronger and stronger. And here's a picture of what it actually looks like under a really high-powered microscope. And you can see the sheath there built up around the neurons. So that's what's actually happening when you learn a motor skill like playing the guitar. And when you learn different skills on the guitar, such as scales, arpeggios, chords, songs, whatever the case may be, that's how we remember things. That's how we become expert at playing that song versus an amateur playing that song, because we practice it hopefully very accurately and build up that network over time. Okay, so given all this knowledge about how the brain works, one of the things that the researchers came up with is called contextual interference. And this is how we continue to learn and break through plateaus. And today I want to just present you with one of these ideas, and in a follow-up video I'll put many more ideas and examples to help you break through those plateaus. This one is called desired difficulty. So contextual interference means in the context of learning a song or a skill or a solo or whatever the case may be, you actually want to introduce some difficulty. Now, you do that after you've already learned the material, can play it accurately, and perhaps play it up to speed, but there might be some difficult or challenging parts that you don't quite have yet. And so the way to bust through that, if you remember that that chart where the power law of practicing, where you learn something really fast and then as time goes by, you practice it over and over and over again, and barely increase your learning. Well, the way to bust through that is to introduce desired difficulty. It is counterintuitive, but it works, and it has shown and been proven to work across many domains. So this isn't just how to learn the guitar or learn music. This is how to learn anything, and that's why it's so universal. So, you know, if you remember when I said about when you learn something, you're actually using a lot less of the brain. And so when it does become easier, automated, and you can just play it without thinking about it, now you're not really learning. And so the way to, you know, learn something, and not only when you introduce some difficulty into that, and I'm going to give you an example here in a second, you're not only busting through that plateau, and perhaps it's a part of a solo that you've struggled with. And I'll show you an example from, you know, my own work where, you know, I've played this song for years. The solo comes, and the very first line of the solo has always been challenging for me, and I always practice it. I know I can play it. I practice it before a gig, but when it comes time to play it, I'm not always sure that I'm going to get it right. And so what I've done is applied this desired difficulty to that portion of the solo to overcome that uncertainty and make sure that I play it accurately every time, up to speed, and it's very fast. That's the challenging part. So how do you introduce the desired difficulty? Well, there are many techniques to do that, but the one I want to show you here is just simply modifying the rhythm. So the song may be, you know, in whatever rhythm, you know, and the notes are in whatever rhythm that it happens to be. And what you want to do here is play it according to the pattern here on the screen. And so you can see the eighth note, the note with the flag on it, equals a half beat. And the dotted quarter note, as they call it, equals 1.5 beats. So in the first line where you see the dotted quarter note on 1, you don't get to the eighth note until a beat and a half later. So 1 and 2 and. That's the way to read that. The plus signs are and, so 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Many of you, I'm sure, have done this. And so the way to get this rhythm is start out by, you know, just tapping your foot to the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then clapping out the rhythm. And so you can't see me tapping my foot, but I'll actually speak it. That's another way to do it. And then I'll clap the rhythm out. So here's how the first line goes: 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So pretty easy to do. But apply that to something where you've learned a different rhythm, and it becomes difficult. So you're going to play the exact same notes of the solo or the scale or arpeggio, whatever you're working on, but you're going to play it in this rhythm instead. And once you get that, you want to introduce some more difficulty, which is the reverse rhythm of that first line on the second line here, where it just reverses the pattern. So it would go like this: 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay? So I'm going to show you how I apply this in the challenging part of the solo that I wanted to work on, and you'll see how I did.
With my guitar here, the solo I'm working on is a solo from Red Barchetta from Rush, and the intro is a series of triplets. Okay, so that's sort of the rhythm of it. But now, you know, introducing some desired difficulty and alternating the rhythm, here's how I would play the first line from the screen. So just to count it out, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and. Okay, so I kept practicing that over and over again and increasing the speed until I got it to be a little bit proficient. So again, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and then to play the second line, the second altered rhythm, which was a little bit more difficult, and I didn't spend as much time on that. Only difficult because I'd never played it before and didn't practice it enough. But it goes something like this: 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. So I would play that too, and so you know, I know that solo, and again, introducing this difficulty made me slow down like I was learning it anew again, or and I had to struggle through it, and that's what desired difficulty is all about. And the magic happens in that anytime we're learning something, to be able to introduce different conditions, like when you're introducing altered rhythms. The other things that can help is, stand up when you're playing. Go into another room in a different environment. Think about, when you go out on stage, you've been practicing in your studio or bedroom or living room, and then you go into a club and everything's different, right? The sound is different, the atmosphere, the lighting, and it's very different. And so getting used to that, all these things that sort of provide that contextual interference, as they call it, enhances your learning and lets you break through that plateau. And this is just a couple of examples. So let's go ahead and play the track from Red Barchetta, and I'll play the opening, play through the solo on that. Okay, here's the solo to Red Barchetta. Sunlight on gold, laughter of the landscape, Okay, so that's one technique to help you with the tough parts. The rest of the solo, it took me a while to get it up to speed and whatnot, but it's that intro that really always gave me problems, especially because I was doing a pick slide at the beginning. Right in the beginning of that solo, there's a pick slide like this, and then you got to come all the way down to the low or the high E string. And that was a little challenging. So getting that thing up to speed, the desired difficulty, alternating the rhythms, really helped me with that. And I hope it helps you as well. I hope you like the video. Please like it and subscribe. I'll have more coming out on this subject, where I can show you a number of different exercises to help you break through all the plateaus that you may be experiencing and get to higher levels. Okay, until next time, we'll see you later. Thank you.